This episode, I'm joined once again by Quinten Weeterings to discuss the life and work of Bruno Schulz. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Quinten Weeterings, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast. It's been quite a while.
Good evening, James. Happy to be here.
We are going to be discussing the writing of Bruno Schulz, who was a Polish Jewish writer born in 1892 and was killed in 1942 during the war. Schulz didn't put much work out, really. If you wanted to read the entirety of Schulz's work, you could do so within 2 books. And most people, if they have heard of Schulz, will be because of what is a collection, but might just be the short story, his most sort of famous short story, The Street of Crocodiles. And so we're going to be discussing his life, his work, his character, which plays an important role, and hopefully I'll get a chance to read out a few excerpts because his style is strange, very strange. But before we jump in, Quinten, just tell me a little bit about your relationship to Schulz's work and where you first came across it.
Yes, I will, James. I think you gave a very good introduction there. Bruno Schulz, Jewish writer from Drohobych, and that's a place I visited myself. It is a place which is now in Western Ukraine, and this section of Europe. You told about his lifetime, but he was born when it was Austrian. Ukraine was independent for a short while. It turned Polish. It was conquered by the Russians. The Russians invaded twice, and then in the end, the Nazi regime took over as well. So Bruno Schulz was killed by a Nazi officer. And this is all tragic and a large chunk of history going on there, layers upon layers. And I wanted to see for myself because Bruno Schulz, for connoisseurs, he is an important writer. And before the war broke out, I traveled to Ukraine rather often, almost every year. And in 2019, I was able to visit Drohobych, and the atmosphere was there. There was even a leaflet. I was surprised that indicated some important places of Bruno Schulz. There is a plaque on the place where he is murdered, and very famously, there was paintings discovered of Bruno Schulz only in this century, which he made frescoes, and they were brought to Israel with help of the Mossad in a covert operation. So that's all been going on in that region.
So he's known. Sometimes these sort of figures, just because it's actually the last conversation that I recorded, sort of related to this, not related to Schulz, but just related to this general idea of forgotten figures or overlooked figures. I had a discussion about Jakob Böhme, and, most people from his area consider him this sort of madman. So it's always nice to hear that figures from a certain area at least get that sort of geographic recognition. Before we, speaking of this area, and before we get into the writing itself, which is, going to be very strange to sort of segue into this, I think we do need a brief overview of Schulz's life. How would you describe him? Would you describe it as unremarkable, strange, caught in the midst of everything at once, it seems?
There is a paradox in this because he was confined to Drohobych. He didn't manage to get out of it. to make a name for himself as an artist, or as a big artist, as a respectable artist, as someone that could live off his art, because that was on his mind, and that didn't work out. The reason why he is a known name is because of his biographer, that is Vygotsky, and he wrote a biography. He even wrote a letter at a very bad timing in the 40s, because he was captivated by the Schulz, and after the war he kept persistently seeking for documents, letters, artworks, trying to get everything together. There's a recent biography by an Israeli writer, Balint, on Bruno Schulz as well, and Balint wrote about the trial of Franz Kafka as well. And these books are they read a bit like a detective. I mean, very knowledgeable. So there's this other story, because there's work that there's not there, but there's also a manuscript called The Messiah, and it's inspired so many people, famous writers as well, because this is supposedly something Bruno Schulz wrote in the 30s. This was going to be his masterpiece, and people, he did try to rescue his works, like bundles of manuscripts during the war, but all was lost. And it does feel exciting to read this biography of Vygotsky, like he's on the trail of it. I mean, he does try to get these papers, and then, you know, everywhere he goes, he gets to hear that, yeah, it's lost, sadly so. But yeah, I'm getting so captivated by it. But maybe get back to your initial question a little bit, James. So like, who was this Schulz person? Mm-hmm. He grew up as the son of a family of merchants. So his dad was a merchant, and he had a building on the central square of Drohobych. And then there was misery, tragedy in the family. Bruno Schulz himself was also a frail man during his life. He didn't have to conscribe to service during the First World War, because he had a heart condition. But his dad also had a condition. The father figures a lot in the stories. Well, what happens? The Russians get into Drohobych. They destroy their family house. The Schulz family, they tried to flee to Vienna, but they got back to Drohobych as well to live there. Schulz finished the gymnasium. He tried to do a study of architecture at the Lviv University. He didn't succeed in that, and then he landed himself a job as an art teacher for the rest of his life at the local school. And the kids must have been very captivated by him. And meanwhile, he did have a large correspondence. So this is the paradox. He was confined to Drohobych, but at the same time, he was a central figure in the avant-garde modernist writing of Poland. He had correspondence with everyone that mattered. They knew him. He wrote letters to Thomas Mann, and together with Witkiewicz and Gombrowicz, he is seen as the three most important modernist writers of the 20th century in Poland.
And he is not to be too cruel to the man, but from the biographical stuff I've read, as a character, it's quite strange at times. Quite a peculiar person, would you say?
I didn't know. Well, I wouldn't be able to say. I don't know the man himself, but I think his situation. So he was frail. He was confined to home for long periods of times. He visited spa places, the spa culture those days in Zakopane, in Kudowa, in Truskawec. Those are all places he frequented. He, after the first year of study, I think he was confined to his house for half a year just for treatment. And The tragedy only increased because his father died, which was, of course, something striking him. His sister, the family had to move in with his sister and her husband. They got children, but the husband of his sister also committed suicide. So for a large chunk of his life, he found himself surrounded by women that he needed to sustain. Most certainly as the time went on, and most certainly when there was the Russian takeover of this part of the world, and the more dire the situation got for Jews, as well as the Nazi occupation came closer.
Mm-hmm. But throughout all of this, he has a fairly astounding imagination. So you wrote about him being an art teacher, and there's a few biographical excerpts, well, not excerpts of the stories he told, but of the fact that he would be able to sort of reel off these extremely imaginative stories that really he was extremely captivating as a storyteller, and he clearly has this or had this distinct imagination. So do you think do you see that as where his passion or purpose for his writing comes in, is that he's confined and it's used as an outlet to enter into this sort of imaginative other world?
I think it helps for people to realize that Bruno Schulz was also a visual artist. Mm-hmm. So he did that early on. There was a number of techniques he mastered, and really way before he published any writers, there was a series of etchings called the Book of Idolatry. It wasn't very successful, but you can see the influence he must have been under. And in numerous analytical texts, I mean, Schulz is not a writer that invites to too much analysis. I don't think you have to read into him in order to really savor the work. But if you look at the visual work, you can see the masochist theme in there. There is the strong connection with Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who is in some ways a second-grade writer from Lviv, also Ukraine. I think many people have heard of Lviv since the war. It's a beautiful Austrian city, and this Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, he wrote a book called Venus in Furs, where he explores this theme of perverse pleasure of being whipped by a woman. His main character is called Gregor, and from what I read of some biographical facts, also supposedly Bruno Schulz must have admitted to friends that the etchings he made were inspired on that book, or I think he even claimed that they were intended as illustrations to that book.
Okay, so he has that. Do you see him as having that kind of relationship to life, a sort of one of humiliation, masochism, being whipped?
That's one part of it, but it's not as it doesn't come as one-dimensional. As I think it's just a perception of the world which we find in his writing. I mean, we have to explore that, but also looking at the so what happened in the war period. In 1941, the Germans took over Drohobych, and for a short while he got some kind of protection by a Nazi officer, very famously Felix Landau. And this must have been a very cruel man, shooting Jews from his window for fun. There's testament to that. But Schulz, because his art got recognized by this Felix Landau, he got commissioned to make the frescoes in the children's room of the Landau villa. And what you see there is that he makes all these dreamlike creations, much of it which is now brought to Israel. But what he also does in that he incorporates figures, and those figures, they resemble the faces he sees in the ghetto. So it's not sensual or aesthetically pleasing, but you see this really distraught Jewish outspoken faces. And I think this tells something of the man and of his perception of the world, and of him not being able to separate the one and the other. And this maybe brings us into the mythology style of his writing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so speaking of his writing, one of the first, just to get an impression of it, this is from the recently released Pushkin Press. It's called Nocturnal Apparitions. It's called The Essential Stories of Bruno Schulz. And it's a fairly small volume, but saying the essential stories, I think, is, considering his, the not that much amount of his work that exists, essential stories. I mean, this is really still half of his stories. But the small section I've chosen to read first is how they open the book. So it's from a short story called August, which is more so a piece of prose. And this is the second paragraph, but I think it gives a good insight into how Schulz has this multi-layered attendance to reality. So, Adela returned from the market on those luminous mornings like Pomona from the flames of the fiery day, pouring out from her basket the colourful bounty of the sun, glistening cherries bursting with juice under transparent skins, dark mysterious morellos whose fragrance always surpassed their flavour, apricots whose golden pulp harboured at the core of long afternoons. Alongside this pure poetry of fruit, she unloaded sides of meat with their keyboards of ribs swollen with strength and nourishment, and seaweeds of vegetables like dead mollusks and jellyfish. The raw material for a dinner whose flavour was as yet unformed and barren, the vegetative, telluric ingredients of the meal whose aroma was wild and redolent of the fields. So, I like this as, I don't know whose decision it was, I'm going to assume it was the editor's decision, to put this story at the beginning, because I think that passage, it emphasizes something in Schulz's work, which is like with the ghetto, right? So like what you said about the drawings from the ghetto, there is a creation of artwork from confinement and the horror and distraught nature of the ghetto and the confinement that Schulz has been in, but something amidst that is still beautiful and strange. You know, you have all these words like juicy and fiery amidst something that is as yet unformed. And this is a thread that I saw throughout Schulz's work, which is a constant mixture which never really finds a place of balance. It's always fluxing of the sort of the grotesque, to be honest, the grotesque, or the possibly grotesque, and the extremely boring. There's so much in his stories that is described as grey and barren, but at the same time there is these sort of sparks amidst that of like an almost excessive vitality in it. It's unnerving at times.
It's one of a kind.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, and that tension is in almost every sentence. It's a balancing act, and you're wondering like how he brings it together, and then you take that amazement, you know, further on in the story, and it keeps on giving like that. I wouldn't say it's everyone's cup of tea, but anyone can realize that this is a maximalist prose. It's incorporating everything. It's putting it in. Thematically drawing on that there's certainly Jewish influence in the work, in the involvement of the stories, the numerology, the symbolism. So that is something that is really there. The language. He's very conscious of the language choosing, even for the Polish people surrounded. So he grew up in a family. Going back to a little bit of biography here, is like so he grew up speaking German, and Polish. So those were his two languages growing up as a kid. But even with his Polish usage, he seemed to have incorporated a lot of Latin influence as well, Latinisms. It must have been estranged for his fellow countrymen to read this as well. Like you see, the seasonality. I think your reading of his text was really nice, James. Yeah. So the seasonality, coloring. You see the colors coming in, biological facts, everything evolving, gisting. That is the world of Bruno Schulz, and in some ways, some stories also reminding me of the world of the paintings of Marc Chagall, for instance, with the creatures in strange positions, strange developments. There is there is also the concept of metamorphosis, linking into to Franz Kafka. Also, something very much there. So I think this is how we can describe the style of Bruno Schulz, and it's for me it's hard not to admire it, and it's hard not to read it and not to want to reach out to where he is with his writing. And as you say, it is a balancing. It's not Bruno Schulz trying to give us a certain insight or to elaborate or to clarify. Well, elaboration is that, but it's never ending.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, and just to perhaps draw those threads of Schulz's together, this is in the middle of his story, The Street of Crocodiles, and this really stood out to me. So he says, it was an industrial and commercial area which garishly displayed its soberly utilitarian character. The general spirit of the age, with its mechanism of economics, had not spared our town either, putting down greedy roots on a patch of its peripheries and growing into a parasitical district there. So The Street of Crocodiles, probably the most famous story by Schulz, being about this strange area, this strange sort of, strange area of this town, where it's sort of somewhat explicit. The forces of the world are made explicit, but at the same time, it's grey, barren, and as you said, you don't really need to read into him. He makes it explicit that it's been overtaken by the parasite of the economics of mechanism. It's this sort of drudgery place, and that in this I see a sort of strange, I guess you could call it Schulzian animism. So it's not an animism where things are full of, with the typical animism where we'd say everything has a soul. Like plants have souls or animals have souls and everything has its own animist being. But like a Schulzian animism where even like the grey street, it doesn't necessarily have a soul, but it has possibly its own agency, its own force within the world. And so when Schulz is placing you within the world, you feel possibly threatened by it, as if every single thing has the possibility to enact something. It's not simply that human beings have agency, but this whole strange form of language that he uses is really overwhelming at times.
Yes, so in order to explain this and to grasp a little bit where he's coming from with this, so there are the two story collections. The one got known in the English-speaking world more as The Street of Crocodiles, but was originally published 1933 as The Cinnamon Shops. And then 4 years later, he published another volume, Sanatorium Clepsydra, which consists both of earlier stories and also later stories. And the first collection of stories, Bruno Schulz himself refers to it as a novel at times. It doesn't feel like a novel, it's several stories. But in order to understand how this came about is he by the time he was writing letters to a very talented Jewish woman called Deborah Vogel, living in Lviv. And through the thanks to the work of Vygotsky, we have quite a number of letters of Schulz surviving, almost 100. Were there more letters, especially the letters to Thomas Mann? This is funny because also these letters missing have also given cause to another writer writing a novella about that, Maxime Bieler. Had we had, would we have those letters today? Those would make a very interesting artwork as well. I think hinting on the philosophical ideas or emotional development, you see that in his letters. You won't find it much in the text, but one has to realize that. So this story of the cinnamon shops came to exist through all this letter writing, which he did to this Deborah Vogel. It was a sort of outing for himself. On the one hand, he got stuck as a school teacher doing the art classes, and there have been attempts of Schulz to sell his artwork abroad, and he did. His artwork was seen in galleries also, and then but the first success was him writing these letters to Deborah Vogel, getting more and more explicit, and then getting the push like, this could be published into something. And then the publication, it was some kind of an event. It got him some notoriety as well, and that got him thrusted into the scene. So yeah, he was writing from his confines, coming up with all these mythology in his writing. So that's where it comes. There's not much of an aim to it. It feels so much as craftsmanship.
I mean, thinking about it now, just to draw in another aspect of this mythologizing of their, I guess from the position, I mean, I would be projecting of what his thought process here was, but from the position of being captured, being stuck in your house for 6 months, probably bedbound or whatever it might be, there's a notion of there always being something behind everything else. There's always a double take. Masks, doppelgangers, everything's not really what it seems, but it's not necessarily conspiratorial. This, as you say, the myth is what's important, not the front. And just to add in another quotation.
Go ahead. I could listen to you reading out the Schulz all evening.
This is regarding this is once again also from the Street of Crocodiles, but I think it's once again a reiteration of what you were saying about him being an extremely explicit maximalist writer that you don't need to read into. He says, reality is as thin as paper, betraying its imitative nature in all its cracks. At times, one has the impression that only in the small patch immediately in front of us does it all come together in exemplary fashion into the pointillized image of a metropolitan boulevarд, while on the edges the whole improvised masquerade dissolves and disintegrates, incapable of keeping up its role, until finally it falls apart behind us into plaster and oakum, the junk room of an enormous empty theatre. The tension of the pose, the artificial gravity of the mask, an ironic pathos tremble on that surface. So, he doesn't trust. He's created a mythos that allows people reading him to not really trust reality, and it's that. I personally do just see it as an animism of distrust, of not really sure what the world is doing, but I'm not. The world is uncanny, I think, would actually be the exact word I would use. I mean, obviously there's a lot of uncanny literature, but this notion of an unheimlich, of it not being that familiar type of home, there's something there in that for Schulz. But I think in that non-familiarity, he doesn't necessarily see a horror or a pessimistic view. There's also something exploratory and that's where the language of like juicy and seasons and things like this comes in, and the colors come in. And his writing is borderline sort of, I don't want to say symbolism, but there's the same excess of language that the symbolists use in their prose pieces, I think, is also here. I don't know. What do you feel about that?
No, certainly. I think you're really onto something here, James. One of the takes I have from the letters. I think it's my turn now. So one of the takes I really love from the letters is where he says, reality takes on certain shapes merely for the sake of appearance, as a joke or form of play. One person is human, another is a cockroach, but shape does not penetrate essence, is only a role adopted for the moment, an outer skin soon to be shed. I think this, this shows maybe even in a more comprised way. It signals the one you read out as well. I think there's some extra dimension. Yeah. One, there's a local dimension to this writing. So him writing from the confines of Drohobych. You also have this person Leopold von Sacher-Masoch coming from there, but with a writer as Joseph Roth. It's not strange for a lot of biographers and people coming after that, saying like, we have works of A. Kafka, of Isaac Babel, of Abashevitz Singer, and he kind of goes needlessly into this list because it's exceptional work, and it's recognizable, it's unique, it's standout. I think there is a local segment to that as well, where he comes from. That's why I was so happy to have been there almost 5 years ago already. And you can't read the work of Schulz apart from Drohobych. There's even writers who say like, my favorite place to be is somewhere I've never been, but this Drohobych, which he sketches, that it seems like such a blessed area, and it's not as much blessing or religious or horror, exactly what you're saying. It's not that he's writing that into it, and that there's no emotional process or development. It's all a phantasmagoria, a going on, I think. Well, he uses the word mythology a lot himself. After reading the biography, I read a short text, which was published in 1938, only called "The Comet." This also contains something which I think you recognize as well. So the comet describes that there's this comet flying over the world, and meanwhile he describes the unfolding of this city life in this Drohobych, where using the forms of bicycles, doorbells, stoves, electricity, everything clinging together, going, and another also characteristic which I think you already noticed is the labyrinthine. It keeps getting further in this feeling you get also from its work.
I mean, and just to throw in one more, this is from the Street of Crocodiles, and I do really admire this story. Our language lacks expressions capable of measuring out the degree of reality or of capturing its density. So let us say it without holding back. The curse of that district is that nothing in it comes to fruition. Nothing reaches its definitivum. All movements, once begun, hang suspended in midair. All gestures prematurely exhaust themselves, unable to pass a certain dead point. And later on in that section, he then brings in just like, if you even to skim your eyes over, like if I was to skim my eyes over the long paragraph that follows that I don't need to read, after this sort of acceptance that language can't the language within this district, whatever that might be, can't read it. Nothing is defined. Everything's constantly fluxing. You skim your eyes over the text and you realize that after this, he begins to use words like flimsiest, tension, puffs, fluid, feverish, shaken, pale. Nothing reaches its definitive definition, and everything's fluxing. Yet at the same time, he uses often excessively empirical language. Like fluid and fluxing and pale and goosebumps, and everything from that point on is strangely. So he enters it constantly into this paradox, and I think it's in that strange paradox that everything in his world is moving, the world is changing. That you feel he puts you in a very strange place, and I don't think he didn't leave too much work behind, as you've said. But and I'm trying to think of other writers who are much like this. I don't think you could read. I would wonder what a full-length Schulzian novel would be, because his writing is such that it works in short bursts. Yeah, sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you.
No. It's good. What we should mention also for Schulz, that he was a school teacher. During the large periods of his life, not being able to make it as an artist, so to say. But in that role, we have testimonies of former pupils. Apparently, he sat in a classroom, and this is something we can, I think, imagine. And he would tell stories to the children. He would just make them up, and they would be captivated, and it would be go on, and it would be dreamlike and fantastic. I think this is the kind of Schulz we can imagine. Yet saying that, so it's not just a storytelling. Of course, I mean there's great storytellers, and there's a great heritage. But reading in there's maybe you're trying to find fault sometimes reading into a book. God knows, maybe I do. He was a knowledgeable man. He knew of the works of Rilke, of Husserl. He borrowed those works. I mean, he was in contact, like I say, with the writers of his time, with the Drohobychs. So it never becomes bland. It never becomes superficial. Even though you skim on a page and you think like, what dictionary has he been in? What is it? It doesn't become one dimensional. He's able to pull it off. And what you said, what would the full novel of Schulz be like? We don't know. And that's why it captivated so many people. They imagined, what would his messiahs be like? Apparently, or Fikovsky says that. So there's been talk of someone trying to sell the Messiah, and the whole book of Cynthia Ozick, also a Jewish writer. She wrote The Messiah of Stockholm. It is about that. It is about the tension of someone selling off a manuscript which is or it's not the Messiah. It was a fun book. I just wanted to read it because I was in the same state of mind.
So why do you think Schulz wrote? Why do you think he wrote? Escape?
That's a good question. As for the art form, I don't think it was his first choice. If you see how explicit the visual artworks of Schulz are, and I've been lucky enough to have some editions which have his drawings together with it, I think is really helpful transporting you to that world. Although in the letters he becomes more of a person doubting himself as well. That there are certain segments where he's like, I won't make it as a visual artist. I won't even make it as a writer. Or now I've got this recognition of the cinnamon stores, and apparently after that, he had difficulty getting the again and putting the output of writing. Yet he couldn't help himself. A funny fact is that when there was the Russian takeover with the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, he sent in a piece of his writing to the Russian editors, and he got the answer: "This is not needed. We don't want more Prousts." Signaling him as a modernist, as someone who's too frivolous. Yet, however, he did manage to do some output on commissioned works in the Soviet realism style of his visual art. So maybe that is an interesting giveaway. Another thing with the sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass, the last collection of stories. There's even a story where he goes to visit his dad, who has died. But in that story, he's kept in a sanatorium where there is no time. They have a different time. It's a funny way of processing everything. For me, it was interesting to read the conception of his friend Drohobych. Well, not friend, fellow artist, Witold Drohobych, a Polish writer who happened to be on a boat to Argentina when the war broke out. And then much later, he published his diary, and he also talked about Bruno Schulz, and he writes, Schulz was a relentless, untempered masochist. One sensed this in him all the time. No, he was not made to dominate. A tiny gnome with enormous head, appearing too scared to dare exist. He was rejected by life and slouched along its peripheries. Bruno did not acknowledge his right to exist. He sought his own annihilation. Not that he wanted to commit suicide. He merely strove for non-being with all his might. In my opinion, there was no sense of guilt in his striving. It was more like the instinct that moves a sick animal to remove itself. He was superfluous. He was extra. It is possible that his masochism also had a different aspect. Well, here comes something I don't know, but it most certainly was homage paid to the powers of being that were trampling him. And I think it's an interesting description of Drohobych not holding back on anything at all. This was written, I think, in 61 or years later. It gives a nice character sketch of the man Bruno Schulz. But yeah, can you say that someone is as masochist that he wanted to pay homage to the powers of being that were trampling him, when you know that that he was killed by a Nazi officer retaliation for another Nazi officer. So yeah, the Karl Günther, the Nazi officer who eventually shot Bruno Schulz, and allegedly the protector of Schulz, Landau, had shot another Jew, and that was the dentist of Karl Günther. And then, well, the story goes that Karl Günther shot Bruno Schulz, and then must have said, "You shot my Jew, and now I shot yours."
And it's sort of, I mean, the ghettos and the Nazism, and eventually being killed by a Nazi over something so disgustingly fickle with regard to a human life. I mean, Schulz's life is a long line of being in a position of being alienated, of being the stranger, of feeling foreign to the world, it seems. And he makes his home between time, between space. In sense, it's very, but I think I do, with the excerpt you read out, I do think there is something correct about that, because I think Schulz is quite damning of himself as a character. I mean, he's explicit about his own alienation, his own, I personally think, strangeness. And he is once again, not to be rude to the man, he is he's got a very distinctive look and physique. I mean, the most famous photo of him is this. He is sat and sort of. Hang on, I've actually got the image. Obviously, you guys can't see it, but he's sat and he's sketching with a strange look in his eyes, sort of completely holding himself together on these steps. And so this description of him as a gnome is quite apt. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are the stairs that were in front of the house where they had to move in when they moved away from the market square. And I've been there. There's a small plaque. There's not a museum. There's no central place. But unfortunately, I think maybe in the 60s, Fikovsky knows. Fikovsky took a picture when those steps were still there, but those steps have been removed now. There's also a sketch of himself, an auto portrait, which I think portrays him in quite the same way. And you see in his sketchings the men are all portrayed as gnome-like figures. They're smaller than the women. They're at the feet of women, or devouring the feet of women. It's it's a funny. It's a funny character trait of this man who was able to produce such captivating words, and then his life also makes us think, of course, what could have been.
Where would you advise people to begin with Schulz?
I think a lot of people will enter with the Street of Crocodiles, and this was Philip Roth issued the translation, and there's been 2 or 3 others already in English, and I don't think that's by no means bad to start with that. People will find out soon enough. It's so characteristic. But then on from that, I really loved reading the letters of Bruno Schulz. Sometimes I don't like reading letters of authors, but his gave away quite a lot of his thinking process. Yes, I believe.
Where do we see his influence?
The influence of Bruno Schulz. Philip Roth, he wrote a book after that himself called the Prague Orgy. It's funny because he creates a figure resembling Bruno Schulz, but placing him in Prague, the city of Franz Kafka. But artists have this. There's the artistic liberty, of course. There's another book by David Grossman called Sea Under Love. There's Jonathan Safran Foer, also inspired by him. It's hard not to. What I tried to say earlier, I think it's hard not to meet Schulz's work and admire it, and you can just admire as you would. Of course, the person may have had his shortcomings, but it's so much artistry, and then there is there's the storytelling, and also this world creating of a mythology, and something children could. I don't know if you have the same, but sometimes with this children literature, you think, it is so rough or it's so mad how it comes to be, and then Bruno Schulz seems the adult version of it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, and in that sense, that sort of madness of children's literature, I think of someone like Roald Dahl actually, but I think maybe that's why he had to leave in that madness is always fighting against this grey sludge in the background.
Yeah, allegedly. He also wrote down like, my ideal goal is to mature into childhood, saying this would be the real maturity. apparently he wrote that. For me, it's an inspiring work, and there are Schulzians out there. So there's a whole academic treatise of what is going on. Maybe one day we'll find more of his work. Maybe we won't find any of his work. I don't think it adds much to go in the analytics of the word use, and that's what I like about it. The work is not as fast. Anyone who reads through the story collections is a fellow reader going through that experience already. There's no more work you need to do. So much enjoyment already there. The writing serving as, I wouldn't say therapeutic, is not the word I would like to use. But him creating this mythology without you having a sense of he's trying to process something. That there is the role of the father, but then it is ever changing as well, and the father ending up a slave on the feet of their servant in the house. There is the power play between actors within the story, and the whole atmosphere, painting that out, which is something I did recognize when I was in that town. And these days, with the war playing in the back of our minds between Russia and Ukraine, and knowing of that turbulent history, and knowing of that, it's all too recent for us, and still knowing that something like this came about.
Is there anything you'd like to add about Bruno Schulz and his work?
Well, I was very happy to talk to you, as I am to anyone, knowing his work. I myself in the Netherlands was for a while. I was in a literary club on Franz Kafka. I think for myself personally, I'm not a big fan of having to read into authors and needing something. I mean, of course, his biographical background, it's very telling, and it helps to know of his paintings, and to have this idea of, there is sexual perversion going on in the work. There's something lurking there, and that there is, of course, a Jewish dimension. Even though Schulz was not a very Jewish writer, but he was killed eventually for being a Jew. What can you say of the man? And he was Polish, for the reception as well, for that place. Now being in Ukraine, he was an essential Polish writer, and it tells you once more what's all going on in a town, in a culture, amongst people. I hope we've done a good job.
He's a difficult writer to. He's a tough writer to explain without people reading him. So hopefully those excerpts have helped, because it's a certain feeling that we're not going to get through our explanations, I don't think. So hopefully we've done a good job. Yeah.
I'm not a reader of Proust, but from what I understand, he's a Proust extraordinary, and with all the fantastic imagery and the lavish language going on, because it is that. So I'm not a fan of people trying to read into literature, and I'm not a big fan of people telling that you should take it easy. I think we agree on that, James. Like, as it is with philosophy, sometimes it's much better to be confronted with the real work and try to work your way through that. And when someone is confronted with the work of Bruno Schulz, I think it is an experience in itself. And you touch on something which comes from pure inspiration, and which leads you into something, into some amazement. And it's always nice to share that experience with others. That's what I would really want to say.
All right. Well, I'll put links for Schulz's books that we've mentioned in the description below, but I feel it's a good place to finish up. Quinten
So do I.
Weeterings, thanks very much.
Yo, thank you.